Andrew Hussie has been one of the most influential minds behind the development of online fan culture, web-based storytelling, as well as the modern idea of the fandom. Among Hussie's many titles and nicknames, he wears author, illustrator, literary theorist, and social phenomenon closest to his sleeve. To truly see his legacy, you need look no further than your local anime, gaming, or pop culture convention. While today, the probability of running into a cosplayer coated head to toe in gray face paint is moderate, from 2012 to 2016, there wasn't a convention hall in all of America that hadn't at some point been host to thousands of gray teens screaming about buckets.
Irrelevant, I will commandeer it from your mouth if I have to.
When younger, Hussie earned his degree in computer science from Temple University. But while his technical background would inevitably aid his success, his cult-like acclaim came through the medium of comics. More specifically, the majority of this acclamation can be accredited to his webcomic Homestuck. Homestuck itself is unlike any other work of media. Originally formatted to mimic old text adventure games, it pulls format and thematic inspiration from across many different platforms. At 14,915 panels, it bridges the worlds of text, image, animation, music, as well as reader interaction. While in culture, it's usually said that one reads Homestuck, in many ways it would be more apt to say you experience Homestuck, both as a medium and as a narrative. However, the praise for this website is only in part due to this technical marvel. A large part of Homestuck's appeal is Hussie's ability to both blend and adapt different narratives from pop culture as well as his own work to perfectly curate the tonality of any given moment. In just one page, you can go from beautifully foreboding poetry about desolation to a crude visual gag about defecation. While out of context, this contrast might seem inconsistent, both of these pages together somehow capture what it's like to be in the final moments of adolescence before having to bear the brunt of responsibility. In many ways, Homestuck mimics the feeling of reading Homer's The Odyssey, just as much as it mimics what it's like to read through a 13-year-old self-insert fanfiction, and yet somehow it's completely its own experience. Some parts are animated to emulate anime tropes, while other parts are pages of pseudo-biblical text describing an alien messiah. Hussie understands this appropriation of style and genre. In an interview with Viz Media, when asked, "What is Homestuck?" Hussie responds with,
"I've thought a lot about that for a long time. It's a shitpost epic."
In many ways, this description illustrates what makes Andrew Hussie such a proficient storyteller. The stories, themes, and ideas Hussie has told have been fairly consistent through his work. But as he grew, he started developing an understanding that pushed the adaptation of his work to the state of admiration it has today. He illustrates the social idea that through the mastery of intertextuality, both internally and externally, the elevation of specific thematic motifs, characters, and narrative beats can transform across mediums. In other words, by looking at Andrew Hussie's evolution as an author, we can see how his ideas grow in strength and complexity when informed first by society, and then ultimately again by themselves. Being open to these metaphorical conversations between mediums is the key to good storytelling and the adaptation of ideas. The first notable literary endeavor Andrew Hussie embarked on was a 3-chapter graphic novel entitled
Whistles, the Starlight Calliope.
Originally intending to be 6 full chapters, the final 3 were never finished. Conceptually speaking, while the narratives in the Starlight Calliope and Homestuck are quite different, Whistles set the foundation for the evolution of Hussie's work. The story centers around Whistles, a young clown working for his master in the Starlight Calliope circus. After a performance injury and the escape from ritualistic euthanasia, Whistles quickly discovers the darker underbelly of the circus underworld.
All clowns of expired status come here. They're processed and fed to the performers and spectators.
The story itself and its relationship with the printed medium it occupies, while somewhat one-dimensional, makes for a genuinely good narrative experience. But it's here where Hussie starts to make specific thematic choices that later develop into the motifs of the AH style. Though his thematic origins lie in the printed pages of the Starlight Calliope, it would be the first and only of his published works to be formatted specifically for the intention of printed publication. When approaching any medium of adaptation, with a special regards to the digital adaptation of printed work, there's a perception that the aforementioned adaptation is inherently of a lesser quality. Thomas Leach, a professor of literary and cultural theory, suggests that this negative perception of moving images is just that, a perception. In his peer-reviewed article, 12 Fallacies in Contemporary Adaptation Theory, the overarching reason for these perceptions on digital adaptation is because
they,
contemporary adaptation theory,
have been practiced in a theoretical vacuum.
Andrew Hussie brings tangibility to the validity of moving images and digital storytelling as a whole. In June of 2007, he launched his website MS Paint Adventures, a place where he would continue to develop his specific method of storytelling. The first of these stories was entitled Jailbreak. Crude in both style and humor, the basic plot has readers submit and vote on a series of actions to get you, the reader, out of jail. This narrative format, which would become a staple through all of his following work, was borrowed from old text-adventure games like Zork or Spider and Web. This is the first time we see Hussie's blatant exploration into intertextuality. The idea that
all texts are somehow connected to a network of existing texts and art forms.
Julie Sanders, an intertextual theorist, identifies this brand of adaptation in her book, Adaptation and Appropriation. Sanders says,
adaptation can be a transpositional practice, casting a specific genre into another generic mode.
Hussie's use of commands like,
say hello to the pumpkin,
and responses like,
what pumpkin?
are clear adaptations of text-adventure tropes cast into this new medium of webcomics. Over his next few comics, he continued to experiment with the incorporation of these different generic tropes. Those range from those found in film noir to those in new wave JRPGs. This open attitude to the concept of intertextuality allowed for the creation and continuation of specific inside jokes that could only exist within the multimedia construct of mspaintadventures.com. The continued reference to the previous stories, such as the consumption of clown meat in Problem Sleuth, and the reoccurring phrase,
what pumpkin,
interested his small yet growing group of casual viewers. While his fluid use of thematic continuity added levels of complexities to his story, it wasn't until Homestuck that Hussie started pushing these ideas to their fullest potentials. As I said earlier, Homestuck is the longest and most popular of Hussie's work, taking up approximately 85% of the pages on the MSPA site. The story itself is almost completely comprised of intricate applications of adaptation, appropriation, and parody. It's quite literally a
living mosaic, a dynamic intersection of textual surfaces.
There are two main areas of focus, contextual format and narrative story. At its simplest form, Homestuck is a story about 4 kids who play a game that ends the world. Off the bat, we can tell that Homestuck is different from its predecessors, both in terms of structure and form. While still operating off of this interactive text-adventure format, Hussie starts implementing new narrative stylings. The most initially obvious example of this being characters actually having dialogue, in the form of web client chat logs. By playing as the kids, we soon get to know our 4 protagonists, John, Rose, Dave, and Jade. Through conversation and observation, Hussie has the kids interact and participate with newspaper clippings, programming texts, rap monologues, and slam poetry, commenting both on the social pop culture of the late 2000s, as well as developing our protagonists' differing personalities.
When a plan gone astray pays off, a wasted craterous ashtray catering to layers of Matt McConaughey's vague remainder dust. Wait, McConaughey wasn't even in any of those Meteor movies, was he?
References like that make up a good portion of Homestuck's dialogue. This is interesting to note because intertextuality is not just the relationship media has with other media, intertextuality is also the relationship media has with society. The story of Homestuck goes one step past the reference of pop cultural figures, iconic brands, and social trends. It actively incorporates them into the narrative. For example, later in the story we're introduced to a group of 12 alien kids called trolls who are playing the same game as our 4 human protagonists. Next, it's revealed that Betty Crocker, yes, that Betty Crocker, is actually the evil troll empress, her imperial condescension. The heinous Batter Witch proceeds to enact her plan of global domination, and with the help of Congressman Guy Fieri, they elected Sane Clown Posse members Jay and Tudope as the first double Juggalo presidents. Of course, this is just one example of many where Hussie's exploring the relationship between Homestuck's narrative story and society. But it's arguably more important to step back to look at the many ties the contextual format has in Homestuck. Again, Homestuck could be viewed through the lens of many different media and storytelling methods. These methods are so tightly woven that it's impossible to chronologically illustrate each thematic motif. Despite this, I will underline a few of the structural storytelling elements to further progress Hussie's journey into the complete understanding of intertextuality. Let us first view Homestuck's relationship to the medium of video games. This is easiest to do because, as we already established, Homestuck has its origins in text adventure games, as well as its digital nature generally. The way we, as the reader, interact with Homestuck is by playing as a character. While Homestuck is a linear story, it's colored with video game motifs, giving the illusion of free choice. The first action the reader is given after meeting a protagonist is to
enter name.
This is a pretty common trope in single-player RPGs. In RPGs, when prompted to enter a name, it's very often that someone will enter a crude or funny name. Homestuck makes fun of this by naming each character with a false name, such as
Flighty Broad
or
insufferable prick,
before ultimately revealing their real pre-chosen name. Now, sometimes this idea of playing as a character becomes more of a literal concept in the story. At different points, Hussie uses interactive flash games where readers can
aggrieve,
aggress,
or
abscond
while in strife with various antagonists. The reason I find this lens so interesting is that by adapting the themes of a digital video game, Hussie is able to parallel the relationship his own story has with its digital medium. This video game analogy stretches out to the constructs of the story itself. Now, this is where we start mixing metaphors. Each section of the story has its own game disc, dividing our stories into acts 1 through 7. These acts are an example of a different narrative adaptation Hussie makes. In many ways, Homestuck's structure is adapted from a Greek or Shakespearean play. It's the story of a hero's quest and creation. Throughout the comic, this is visually represented by the opening and closing of curtains before and after each act. These curtains, both metaphorical and real within the canon of Homestuck, hold much significance in relationship to the time, the space, and the particular universe any given act takes place in. Much like an actual theater, Homestuck has intermissions between its acts. These intermissions can range from seemingly completely tangential to the continuation of major plot lines. Looking through the specific lens of thematic adaptation also helps to recontextualize Hussie's choice to add direct character dialogue. Because all the dialogue occurs through some variation of chat client, the way conversations read are strikingly similar to how dialogue's read in a script. Rather than using expository terms like
she said,
or
he replied,
characters simply state their dialogue. In both mediums, characters' lines are differentiated by a name or title preceding each line of dialogue. These elements altogether seem to ground Homestuck to a more emotionally significant story. By appropriating elements of more classic academic literature, Hussie validates the value of a story despite its digital medium. Other tropes, like the use of class specs, the character Calliope, and the tale of the signless, all borrow from classic literature as well as other genreic modes such as board games, Egyptian mythology, and biblical scripture. But about halfway into Homestuck, and just before the height of its popularity, Hussie makes a switch in his approach to adaptation. Looking back at Hussie's journey into understanding intertextuality, at some point he just gets it. After 6 years of weaving together different literary formats and pop cultural styles, his use of adaptation was no longer an experiment, but instead a well-crafted tool. Simply defining intertextuality as a conversation between society and his work as adaptation was no longer a big enough concept to hold Hussie's attention or the ever-expanding tapestry of his stories. So, while still heavily influenced by external narratives in the mediums they occupy, Hussie began to open lines of communication between his work and itself. In a sense, he began to adapt his own work. This again manifested itself in two ways: the self-adaptation in canon of characters, themes, motifs, as well as the adaptation of Homestuck's framework as a meta-narrative. In the construct of the story itself, Hussie uses the idea of adaptation to draw thematic parallels between ideas, as well as to make fun of weak or annoying concepts. One of the easiest examples of this to spot is the introduction of the alpha trolls halfway into the story. As I mentioned earlier, our 4 human protagonists inevitably befriend 12 kids of an alien species called trolls. Each of the trolls have their own introduction and are given the entire 5th act to develop their characters. Despite the increasing number of protagonists, each of the 12 trolls has a distinct personality, all with their own complex problems and interests. The alpha trolls are a separate group of 12 alien kids, younger versions of the original 12's genetic predecessors. While their relevance to the plot happens in varying degrees, the alpha trolls are essentially heightened parodies of the original beta trolls. For instance, Airden Empora, a melodramatic hipster who gets dumped by his girlfriend, becomes Kronos Empora, a sleazy pickup artist who is perpetually rejected by everyone. By adapting characters inside of a text, Hussie's able to make the theoretical conversations of intertextuality happen in real time. Hussie continues to blur the lines between the tangibility of canon and the abstraction of literary theory with his own death. Hussie establishes himself as a character in the canon of Homestuck about halfway through the 4th act. This
highly indulgent self-insertion into the story
was originally meant to be a humorous way to recap the first year. Soon though, over the span of the comic, Hussie starts tampering directly with the plot until he's ultimately killed by Homestuck's surmounting villain, Lorentz. This is a literal adaptation of the literary idea of death of an author. This literary idea relates directly to intertextuality, as it views the intentions or values of an author to be
tyrannically centered.
In other words, if you subscribe to this philosophy, you're inherently disregarding any credibility the author has in assigning value to the story. But in Homestuck, a text in which the author is directly woven into the construct of the story, Hussie adapts this literary idea to argue the opposite. When talking about the role of the author in appropriation, Leach poses that
extending the analysis of author figures in adaptations concludes that such adaptations recognize the canonical text they adapt.
In a sense, it's the factual inaccuracies of an unreliable narrator that frames the work itself. Hussie understands this idea and consequently strives to blur the lines between interpretation, canon, and medium. These ideas all come to a head in the Homestuck epilogues, an ultimate testament to the narrative ability Hussie has honed. If Homestuck subtly explores the relationship between its story, its author, and its medium, the epilogues scream it louder than the great 𝘏𝑰𝐽𝐵 herself. The synopsis of the epilogues on the Homestuck website reads,
Tales of dubious authenticity.
Before we fully unpack what that means, let's first look at a line of literary theory crafted by Andrew Hussie himself. This is the theory of meat or candy. Meat, as a concept, has been present in Hussie's stories from as far back as the Starlight Calliope. In Homestuck, characters Calliope and Caliborn, twin alien cherubs, grow up exclusively eating meat and candy. But narratively, these concepts grew to represent more. In the Homestuck epilogue's prologue, yes, that exists, Calliope offers the readers a choice of meat or candy. In this binary theory, meat represents action, resolution, and plot progression.
You know the meat will be rich and filling, and if you're being honest with yourself, you haven't had the most robust diet as of late.
While candy represents character development, lighthearted banter, and shipping.
Something that'll go down easy and fill you with bright energy as you pass the time with your friends.
This is yet another example of Hussie making a literary theory tangible and setting up the two separate stories completing the Homestuck epilogues. Now having the contextual format of the epilogues established, we can finally take a look at the media itself. When first clicking on the Homestuck epilogues, you're met with a list of character tags and content warnings. While Homestuck is a comic that actively adapts video game tropes, the epilogues take it a step further by essentially becoming the thing it's adapting, a fanfiction. The entire screen of content warnings is a direct appropriation from the format of the website Archive of Our Own. AO3 is an online host of fanfiction and fan content from a variety of different fandoms. The appropriation of this format goes well past the first page as, unlike Homestuck proper, the entire epilogue is written in prose. This all plays back to the idea of dubious authenticity, or canonical uncertainty. At the beginning of the epilogue, because the story takes place after the conclusion of Homestuck, the characters essentially exist outside of canon. Rose explains,
There is an important distinction between events which can be considered to occur inside canon, outside canon, and those which are not canon at all.
In a sense, without the confines of the comic, without the woven tapestry of intertextuality, and without Andrew Hussie, our characters exist without grounding, bringing us back to our two paths, meat or candy, while keeping in mind the narrative construct of the fanfiction. The epilogues explore a transcended iteration of Hussie's death of an author. Okay, honestly speaking, me to you, full disclosure, the first time I read the epilogue, I didn't necessarily enjoy it. Neither path is particularly rewarding. In the meat path, readers re-enter the confines of canon with John, leaving behind all of our friends we made to peacefully live out their lives without us. This re-entering of canon directly addresses Homestuck as a work that needs to be adapted. However, in our quest to tie up loose ends by adapting Homestuck to this new medium, the story quickly devolves, John dies, and all the characters live out their life in realistic, unsatisfying emotional turmoil. In the Candy Path, John decides to stay with his friends outside of canon, ignoring any greater responsibility to the conclusion of Homestuck proper. But instead of getting any emotionally rewarding payoff from the 8,000 pages of character development in Homestuck, in the Candy Path we see our protagonists are not only still being challenged by the same conflicts, but in many ways have fully succumbed to their negative character traits. In many ways, the Candy Path is a refusal to engage in the conversations of intertextuality. Without the groundings of Hussie or canon, our characters exist as exaggerated character traits in a vacuum, much like in a fanfiction. Dirk, a character who is hyper-aware of his splintering selves, commits suicide and hopes to escape the non-canonical nature of his existence. Of course, this fanfiction-like exaggeration is done intentionally, as it's later revealed that's exactly what it is. The Candy Path is being written by 𝐂𝐴𝑡𝐚𝐩𝐿, as she tries to give everyone the long yet hollow lives that she could never have. She's actively struggling against Dirk, who, after dying, merges with all of his splintering selves to become his ultimate self. This ultimate Dirk gains the ability to control canon, and proceeds to write the Meat Path. 𝐿𝐼𝐴𝑝's adaptation of the narrative is a misguided attempt to help our protagonist live out a fruitful life outside of canon. Dirk's hijacking of canon is intended to bring about as much realism and suffering in attempts to propagate his own existence. Both exist as a response to Homestuck and the ideas of intertextuality. What Hussie is trying to say in the Homestuck epilogues, and consequently all his work prior, is that the perception of a story will never fully be understood unless given the context of intertextuality. 𝐿𝐼𝐴𝑝 summarizes this best herself.
For as long as the hypothetical speaker of a speakerless story remains masked, then it is true that the story could be seen as either speakerless or spoken. Once a hidden speaker becomes unmasked, then retroactively, the story must be considered spoken all along, and so too do we retroactively change how we regard what has already been spoken.
This is why the perception of the epilogue changes once given the context of who's in control of the narrative. It seems fitting that the epilogue has multiple authors, both in canon and in actuality. It's also why, contextually, Homestuck as a narrative wouldn't work without Hussie. The cult-like popularity that Andrew Hussie managed to garner over his career as a writer, illustrator, and storyteller is easily justifiable once understanding the complexity of his work. Unlike other writers, Hussie doesn't focus on developing his skills in one genre.
A medium itself is not a genre. A medium like comics or novels or plays is a unique form of communication used to tell stories in any given genre.
His evolution into mastering the nuances of adaptation is clearly apparent across the board. At heart, his stories take place in format across many different mediums, yet his stories tell the importance of flexibility when it comes to appropriation and parody. Hussie's storytelling ability went from spinning isolated narratives to conversing with society, and then inevitably became conversations with themselves. It's not that a source material is better than an adaptation, and it's not that an adaptation is better than the original. It's that by understanding intertextuality, you can elevate narrative elements to their greatest potential across media adaptations. In the words of Andrew Hussie,
just go with your gut. Don't sweat the small stuff. There are many more important things out there to fuck yourself up over.